Ladies and gentlemen, there's something fascinating about how the human mind handles love, especially in the lives of those who live beneath the brightest spotlight. The paradox of visibility and intimacy is something science has long struggled to define. We can measure the speed of light, the curvature of space, and the firing patterns of neurons. But we cannot quantify the gravity that two souls exert upon one another in silence. In the private world of a man whose every move seems public, love takes on an entirely different form. It becomes less about romance and more about refuge. For someone whose intellect races across galaxies, whose mind bends around technology, rockets, and the architecture of human destiny, love is not simply an emotion. It's a neurological sanctuary. When neuroscientists study attachment, they often describe love as a biochemical storm: oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, all dancing together in an elegant neurochemical choreography. But what happens when that chemistry unfolds inside a person who is constantly navigating the tension between genius and chaos, between invention and isolation? For someone who lives in the orbit of relentless ambition, love can't merely be a spark. It must be an anchor. In the case we're exploring today, that anchor exists quietly, almost invisibly, not in headlines or red carpets, not in staged photographs or social feeds, but in the stillness between meetings, in the silence between launches, in the quiet after a long day of impossible decisions. That's where the hidden love of a visionary truly lives, not as a performance, but as a pulse. People often assume that those who chase the stars are running away from something here on Earth. But the truth is often the opposite. The more one reaches outward, the more one realizes the necessity of something, or someone, who brings them inward again. Someone who can look past the armor of intellect and see the vulnerable human underneath. Science gives us a word for that emotional balance: a homeostasis. It's the brain's way of keeping the system stable amidst chaos. Emotionally, it means returning to a baseline of safety after turbulence. For someone who leads multiple revolutions, in energy, in transportation, in space, finding emotional homeostasis is not a luxury, it's survival. And here lies the real story. The hidden love is not about secrecy for its own sake. It's about protection. Neuroscience tells us that when the amygdala, the emotional core of the brain, senses threat, whether from criticism, intrusion, or exposure, it triggers a cascade of defensive responses. For most people, that threat might be a conflict at work or a social argument online. For someone under constant global scrutiny, the threat is magnified 1,000-fold. So, love must exist in a protected space, a quiet corner of the brain and the heart where the noise cannot enter. That's what psychologists call an attachment sanctuary, a relationship that functions as a psychological shield against the world. And when that sanctuary is exposed to the public, it begins to erode. The chemistry changes. The trust becomes fragile. The emotional circuits that were once stable begin to fire unpredictably. That's why, for someone like this, love must remain unseen, not because it's hidden, but because it's sacred. Because in a world that monetizes attention, the rarest form of wealth is privacy. I've seen this in my research on high-performance minds. The more cognitively extreme a person's life becomes, the more they crave simplicity and love. Their brains are like overloaded processors, constantly running simulations, ideas, risks, futures. When they find someone who makes them feel, rather than think, the mind finally exhales. That exhale is worth protecting. There's a neural concept known as cognitive load theory. It explains that our brains can only process a limited amount of complex information before fatigue sets in. Now imagine living a life where every decision affects millions, where the stakes of every idea stretch across nations, and where failure is global news. In such a mind, love can't be another source of complexity. It must be the opposite, a place of effortless clarity. That's what this hidden relationship represents, not scandal, not secrecy, but sanctuary. A neurological necessity disguised as romance. And when we think of love in that way, it stops being a tabloid headline and starts being a kind of miracle. Because love, in its purest form, is the only force capable of softening even the hardest minds. I've met people who operate at the edge of innovation. Entrepreneurs, scientists, astronauts, artists. And they all describe the same paradox: the higher you go, the lonelier it becomes. The view from the top may be breathtaking, but it's also isolating. The air gets thinner, the noise quiets down, and the heart starts whispering for something real. That's when a hidden love steps in. Not as distraction, but as restoration. It restores humanity to those who are expected to be superhuman. It reminds them that behind every algorithm and rocket and breakthrough, there's still a pulse that beats for connection. In neuroscience, we sometimes call this the paradox of purpose. It's the phenomenon where the more purpose-driven someone becomes, the more their brain risks emotional depletion. The circuits of motivation, primarily governed by the dopamine system, can, over time, override the circuits of emotional empathy. It's not that such individuals stop caring. It's that their brain adapts for survival in an environment of relentless drive. But love, especially the kind that's quiet, grounded, and unseen, reactivates those dormant circuits. It brings warmth back to the neural landscape. It's the human equivalent of rebooting the emotional operating system. And this is why keeping that love hidden isn't avoidance. It's preservation. Because once the public enters the equation, the brain's chemistry changes again. The oxytocin-driven calm is replaced by cortisol-driven vigilance. Instead of feeling safe, love becomes a performance. Instead of breathing freely, it starts holding its breath. The world often misunderstands this. It confuses privacy with secrecy, and secrecy with guilt. But to the trained eye, to anyone who studies the human mind, privacy is not about hiding. It's about healing. It's about giving emotions the space to unfold without judgment. Let's take a real-world analogy from neuroscience. When the brain experiences trauma, it doesn't immediately talk about it. It goes silent first. It processes internally, protects the wound, and only later, when the environment feels safe, does it share. That's what hidden love is. The brain's way of protecting something precious until the world feels safe enough to understand it. And sometimes, that moment never comes, not because of fear, but because the love itself was never meant to be displayed. Some things grow best in shadow. Some relationships are photosensitive. They bloom in darkness and fade in light. This is not about shame. It's about sanctity. Because when love becomes public property, it loses its depth. The brain begins to anticipate, perform, and adjust to the audience. And that is the death of authenticity. So when we look at a man whose life is lived under cameras, whose every tweet becomes a headline, we must understand that protecting love from that glare is not eccentricity. It's neuroscience in action. The human brain can adapt to stress, but it cannot thrive without emotional safety. And emotional safety is incompatible with constant exposure. That's why the hidden love we're discussing isn't an escape from reality. It's the most realistic, grounded thing in his life. Because in the end, even the most visionary minds are still governed by the same fragile circuits of attachment, longing, and hope. They might design rockets and electric cars, but they still crave what we all crave: to be seen, not by the world, but by one person who understands. That is what this hidden love represents. A moment of recognition between two people in a world that demands constant performance. It's not the loud kind of love that fills tabloids. It's the quiet kind that fills the spaces between thoughts. The kind that reminds a restless mind that it's human after all. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, what's most extraordinary is that even in silence, love leaves traces, not in words, not in public gestures, but in the subtle shifts of a person's rhythm. You can see it in the way they pause before speaking, in the softness that sneaks into a voice, usually sharpened by command. You can see it in the rare moments when focus bends toward something unseen. As if the mind, so used to conquering galaxies, has found a single orbit worth staying in. Scientists might call that attunement. It's when two nervous systems align so completely that one begins to mirror the other. Heart rates synchronize, breathing patterns converge, Even brain waves find harmony. In simple terms, it's connection at the biological level. And in those attuned moments, no words are needed. It's an unspoken code between two consciousnesses. For someone used to commanding rockets and algorithms, this experience can be almost alien. Because here, control has no meaning. Here, surrender is the most intelligent act. That's something very few can understand. That surrender isn't weakness, it's the deepest form of trust the human brain can produce. It activates circuits of safety so profound that they lower stress hormones, stabilize neural firing, and allow true vulnerability to emerge. But imagine trying to maintain that delicate synchronization when the outside world is watching every move, analyzing every glance, assigning meaning to every silence. The external noise can scramble the signal. It can fracture the neural harmony that love depends on. That's why some bonds must live in quiet, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Psychologists studying high, achieving individuals have found a fascinating pattern. The higher a person's public visibility, the more likely they are to protect their emotional attachments with secrecy. Because exposure transforms intimacy into spectacle. And when love becomes a spectacle, it stops being love, it becomes narrative. This is where the story takes on a deeper resonance. Because hidden love, for a mind like his, isn't a contradiction, it's coherence. It's the brain's way of reconciling two impossible forces, global visibility and personal vulnerability. And in that reconciliation, something beautiful happens. Authenticity survives. The truth is, the more extraordinary a life becomes, the more ordinary one's heart wishes to be. Every launch, every invention, every revolution in thought creates distance between the person and the world. But love closes that distance in an instant. It collapses the hierarchy between genius and simplicity. It reminds the most complex minds that joy isn't found in the stars. It's found in the quiet orbit of another soul. In neuroscience, there's a principle known as limbic resonance. It refers to the emotional synchronization between two beings. The way one person's emotional state can modulate another's through subtle cues, tone, gesture, gaze. It's the scientific foundation of empathy. When two people experience limbic resonance, their brains enter a state of mutual regulation. Stress lowers, creativity rises, the sense of isolation dissolves. Now, imagine what that means for someone whose life is defined by relentless intellectual strain. That moment of limbic resonance, that single, invisible emotional calibration, can be more healing than any therapy, more grounding than any achievement. It's the mind's reminder that even amidst all the machinery of intellect, emotion is the most advanced technology of all. This hidden love, then, is not about secrecy, it's about sustenance. It keeps the mind alive in a world that often demands emotional numbness. It keeps the soul tethered to something real when everything else floats in abstraction. When you look at someone like this, a person who has carried humanity's collective imagination toward Mars, who builds machines to outlast lifetimes, you might assume their emotional world is mechanical too. But nothing could be further from the truth. The more one understands the mechanisms of reality, the more one yearns for the mystery of feeling. Because feelings are the last frontier the rational mind can't conquer. And perhaps that's what makes hidden love so magnetic. It represents the one thing that even the most brilliant minds can't engineer. It's not a system to optimize, not a project to manage. It's chaos that brings peace. It's unpredictability that feels safe. It's vulnerability that restores strength. Every scientist knows that chaos is not disorder. It's complexity we don't yet understand, and that's what love is. The most elegant form of complexity, self-organizing and self-sustaining, if only we allow it to breathe. But in the glare of public life, love suffocates. Every narrative adds weight. Every rumor shifts the balance. And so, the only way to preserve its authenticity is to make it invisible, to let it exist without definition. In one sense, this hidden love becomes a private laboratory of the heart, a place where vulnerability is the experiment and trust is the result. And if we were to peer into that lab, not with cameras, but with compassion, we would see something deeply human: two people choosing to remain unseen. Because being unseen is the only way to stay whole. There's something poetic about that. The idea that the most influential man in the world might only find peace in the moments no one else will ever see. It's a reminder that greatness isn't about constant exposure. It's about knowing what to protect. When you strip away the rockets, the factories, the data, the headlines, what remains is the same fragile architecture that lives inside all of us. The limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, the heart beating not for conquest, but for connection. And when that connection is found, it becomes the most valuable invention of all. This is why those who truly understand love never speak loudly of it. Because love that must announce itself is already half lost. Real love doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need validation. It only needs understanding, the kind that happens in silence, the kind that heals without words. And maybe that's the true legacy of this hidden love. Not what the world will someday uncover, but what it already sustains, in private, a space where the mind can rest, the heart can be unguarded, and the soul can finally stop performing. For a man whose life is a constant act of creation, that private world is not an escape, it's a return. A return to something unquantifiable, something that no amount of genius can replicate. Something that, for all our science and technology, remains the oldest form of human truth: to love and be loved quietly. When neuroscientists look at brain scans of people in love, they see areas of the brain light up, not in the regions of logic or ambition, but in those tied to empathy, memory, and safety. The amygdala softens. The prefrontal cortex slows. It's as if the brain itself bows in reverence to something greater than thought. And perhaps that's what this hidden love truly is. A neurological miracle hiding in plain sight. The quiet proof that even the most brilliant minds are still, at their core, beautifully human. So when we hear stories, whispers, or speculations about what lies behind those closed doors, about who might be standing quietly beside the storm, we should not rush to uncover it. We should pause and respect it. Because some stories aren't meant to be told, they're meant to be lived. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. In a world obsessed with exposure, the bravest thing you can do is protect what's real. In an age where everything is broadcast, the rarest act of love is silence. Because love, at its highest form, isn't about being seen by everyone. It's about being understood by one. That is where the real story lies. Not in the spotlight, but in the shadows that guard it. Not in the noise, but in the stillness that sustains it. And perhaps, someday, when history remembers all the machines built and the empires formed, it will also remember the one thing that powered them all. Not ambition, not genius, but the quiet pulse of a hidden love that kept one restless heart human. Thank you.